The night sky over Normandy was alive with fire. It wasn't the kind that warmed or the kind that comforted. It was the kind that killed. Tracers sliced the darkness in red and green arcs, German flak guns roaring from below, their explosions blooming like deadly flowers. The hum of engines above was deafening, the roar of C-47 transport planes carrying their precious, terrified cargo, America's 101st Airborne Division. Private Jack Red Callahan gripped the static line with trembling hands, his knuckles bone-white beneath the fingerless gloves. Around him, the cabin smelled of oil, sweat, and fear. The red jump light cast eerie shadows on the faces of the men, boys, really, who were about to leap into the unknown. Somewhere in that darkness was the small French town of Carentan, a place most of them had never heard of before. Yet, within the next 72 hours, its name would be burned into history and into the minds of those who survived. This was June 6, 1944, D-Day. But this wasn't Omaha Beach or Utah Beach. This was the silent war in the sky. The mission was clear: secure the roads and bridges between Utah and Omaha, link the beaches, and hold the ground until reinforcements could arrive. And at the center of it all was Carentan, a critical junction the Germans would fight to the last man to keep. The red light flicked to green. The jumpmaster's voice cut through the thunder of engines. Go! 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 Jack's boots hit the metal lip of the door. The world beyond was chaos. Tracer fire, explosions, clouds illuminated by burning aircraft. Then he was falling. The blast of cold air ripped at his face, his parachute snapping open above him with a violent jerk. For a moment, suspended in the night, he could almost pretend he was floating. But below, Normandy burned. Around him, parachutes bloomed like dandelions in the wind, many drifting far off course. The flak was relentless, and the German gunners didn't care if the targets were soldiers in the air, defenseless and slow. Jack watched in horror as one chute burst into flames, its occupants screaming into the darkness before vanishing. Another man landed in a hedgerow, his canopy tangled, machine gun fire cutting him down before he could even free himself. Jack hit the ground hard. The smell of wet earth mixed with smoke filled his nostrils. He cut himself free from the harness, his M1 carbine at the ready. But the field was empty, no sign of his unit. No sign of anyone, just the distant rumble of battle and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Somewhere, he knew, other men from his division were scattered across miles of countryside, lost and alone. The night drop had been a disaster. German flak and poor navigation had thrown entire units off target. What was meant to be an organized landing had turned into chaos. Jack wasn't alone for long. A shadow moved in the hedgerows. Sergeant Frank Mallory, his face smeared with mud, helmet askew. "You're a long way from the drop zone, kid," Mallory said, crouching low. "We all are." The two of them pushed forward, avoiding roads, moving through hedgerows that turned the French countryside into a maze. Occasionally, they'd spot another paratrooper, sometimes alive, sometimes hanging lifeless from a tree, his parachute swaying gently in the breeze. By dawn, they had gathered a small group of stragglers, 10 men, each from different companies, none of them exactly where they were supposed to be. Their orders were simple on paper but hellishly complex in reality. Get to Carentan, link up with the rest of the division, and hold it against whatever the Germans threw at them. But even in those first hours, one thing was becoming clear: Carentan was not going to be taken easily. The Germans knew the town's value. They had fortified every approach, mined the roads, and dug into the bocage, the thick, ancient hedgerows that acted like natural fortress walls. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, German paratroopers, men every bit as skilled and determined as the Americans, were waiting for them. Somewhere behind the German lines, Oberst Friedrich von der Heydt studied his maps. He had been told to hold Carentan at all costs. For him, this was not just another town. It was the key to pushing the Americans back into the sea. His men, battle-hardened veterans of the Eastern Front and Italy, were dug in deep, their MG-42 machine guns trained on the most likely avenues of attack. The stage was set for one of the most brutal close-quarters battles of the Normandy campaign. But before the fight for Carentan could begin, the 101st had to survive the journey there. As Jack's ragtag squad moved toward the town, they stumbled upon a farmhouse. Inside, they found a terrified French family. A mother, 2 children, and an elderly grandfather. Through broken English and hand gestures, the family warned them, "Boches, partout, Germans everywhere." The woman pressed a small loaf of bread into Jack's hands, her eyes pleading. "Please," she whispered. "No fight here." But Jack knew there would be no avoiding it. The war was coming to Carentan, and nothing, not the bocage, not the minefields, not even the Fallschirmjäger, would stop it. By mid-morning, they could hear the fighting ahead, the sharp rattle of machine gun fire, the deep thump of mortars, the distant shouts in German and English. Smoke drifted over the fields, and the occasional boom of artillery rolled like thunder. Somewhere ahead, the first elements of the 101st had already reached the outskirts of Carentan, and they were in trouble. Jack's squad broke cover and pushed forward, every step bringing them closer to the maelstrom. The hedgerows seemed to close in around them, the air thick with tension. Somewhere above, the church bells of Carentan began to toll, not for mass, but as a warning. This was no longer about D-Day. This was about survival. And for the men of the 101st Airborne, the road to Carentan would be paved in blood. The morning of June 12, 1944, in Carentan, was deceptive. A thin mist clung to the narrow streets, softening the jagged outlines of ruined houses. The smell of smoke and gunpowder lingered from the fighting the day before. Birds did not sing here anymore. The air was filled instead with a tension so thick that it felt like the entire town was holding its breath. For the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, there was no time to admire the scenery or mourn what had been lost. They were here for one purpose: to take Carentan. Without it, Utah Beach and Omaha Beach would remain dangerously separated, and the Germans would have a chance to push them back into the sea. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole stood at the edge of the last stretch of open ground before the town, what would later be known as Purple Heart Lane. In front of him, a causeway cut through open fields, flanked by ditches full of water and crawling with enemy fire. The Germans had dug in at the far end, turning every hedge and ditch into a killing zone. Cole knew that the moment his men stepped onto that road, they would be exposed to machine guns, mortars, and snipers. But there was no other way forward. He looked down the line of exhausted, mud-covered paratroopers, men who had been fighting almost non-stop since they dropped into Normandy. Their eyes were hollow, but their grips on their rifles were steady. The order came, "Move out." The first men stepped onto the causeway, their boots splashing in shallow water. Almost instantly, German machine guns roared to life. Bullets cracked through the air, hitting the dirt and water with terrifying precision. Men dropped to the ground, hugging the edges of the ditch for cover. The causeway had become a shooting gallery. Cole didn't hesitate. He waded into the ditch and pushed forward, shouting for his men to keep moving. Mortar shells began to fall, sending mud and fragments of metal into the air. One explosion tore through a squad just ahead, scattering bodies into the water. But the column kept inching forward, yard by yard. As they neared the German strongpoint at the far end of the causeway, the fire intensified. The paratroopers were pinned down, unable to move without being cut to pieces. Cole could feel the battle slipping away. He knew that staying here meant certain death. There was only one option left: close the distance, fast. Cole climbed out of the ditch, pistol in hand, and stood fully exposed. He pointed toward the enemy line and shouted the words that would be burned into history: "Fix bayonets!" A strange silence fell over the men for half a second. Then, with a collective roar, the paratroopers surged forward, charging across open ground under withering fire. The sound was deafening. Rifles firing, grenades exploding, men screaming. The Germans, stunned by the sudden and desperate assault, faltered. Cole's men slammed into the enemy position with brutal force. Bayonets flashed, rifles cracked at point-blank range, and hand-to-hand combat erupted in the hedgerows. The fight was savage and intimate, the kind of battle where victory came down to inches and seconds. When it was over, the German position was silent, its defenders dead or captured. But the victory had come at a staggering cost. Nearly half of Cole's men lay dead or wounded on the causeway. The ground was littered with helmets, rifles, and the bodies of men who had fought to the last breath. It was here that the name Purple Heart Lane was earned. The surviving paratroopers pressed on, entering the outskirts of Carentan. The streets were narrow, lined with houses that had been shattered by artillery. Every window, doorway, and pile of rubble was a potential ambush point. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew they could not retreat. Snipers in church towers, machine gunners hidden in basements, riflemen darting from alley to alley. The Americans advanced methodically, clearing buildings one by one. Grenades were tossed through doorways before men rushed in, rifles ready. In some cases, fights broke out inside cramped rooms where two enemies would find themselves face to face with no time to aim, only to lunge, shove, or smash with whatever they held. The sound of battle echoed through the town. Sharp bursts of gunfire, the heavy thud of mortars, the crack of rifle shots, and the screams of the wounded. Smoke curled from shattered windows, and the cobblestone streets were streaked with blood. In the chaos, the paratroopers relied on each other more than ever. Squads moved like single organisms, covering each other's advances, dragging wounded men out of the line of fire, shouting warnings and targets over the din. It was a brutal ballet of survival, played out in the ruins of a once peaceful town. By afternoon, they had pushed deeper into Carentan. The Germans were falling back, but their resistance was fierce. At one intersection, a machine gun nest pinned down an entire platoon until a paratrooper crawled along a drainage ditch, popped up just feet away, and tossed in a grenade. The explosion silenced the gun, but the blast also wounded the man who had thrown it. His buddies pulled him back, blood trailing behind, but he smiled through the pain. Cole's radio crackled with a report. The 506th and 501st Parachute Infantry Regiments were converging, slowly squeezing the Germans from both sides. But the enemy had no intention of surrendering easily. As night approached, the Americans prepared for a final push toward the town center. Artillery thundered in the distance, and flares lit the sky in brief, ghostly flashes. The streets seemed even narrower in the dark, the shadows alive with danger. Somewhere ahead, the Germans were digging in for one last stand. Cole walked among his men, checking their positions. He could see the exhaustion in their faces, the grime and blood on their uniforms. Yet there was something else too: determination. These men had come too far, lost too much to stop now. The next day would bring the climax of the fight, but in this moment, under the flickering light of distant fires, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne steeled themselves for whatever waited in the heart of Carentan. They were about to face the bloodiest street fighting they had ever known, and every man understood that only one side would walk away. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows like a shroud, wrapping the battlefield in a ghostly silence. Every breath felt heavy, damp with the smell of earth churned by boots and mortar blasts. For the men of the 506th PIR, every step toward Carentan was like wading deeper into a nightmare. Their boots squelched in mud, their rifles slick with moisture. Somewhere ahead, the crossroads that would decide the fate of this battle waited. But so did the Germans, and they were ready. Captain Winters led from the front, his eyes scanning the treeline for the slightest hint of movement. Behind him, the paratroopers moved low and fast, their discipline forged in the fire of D-Day still holding strong. The mission was clear: seize the crossroads, cut off the German reinforcements, and take Carentan before the enemy could regroup. But the clarity of the mission did nothing to ease the dread that sat heavy on their shoulders. The first shots cracked through the mist without warning. A burst of MG-42 fire tore into the hedgerow to Winters's left, sending men diving into the ditch. The sound was deafening, like a chainsaw chewing through the air. Sergeant Lipton shouted orders, his voice straining to be heard over the metallic roar. Grenades arced over the hedgerow, thudding into the ground with dull, wet explosions. Dirt and leaves rained down on the men as they crawled forward, inch by inch. In the German positions, Oberstfreiter Karlbrenner kept his finger steady on the trigger of the MG-42, sweeping the field in controlled bursts. The Americans were tough, too tough for his liking, and their determination was as relentless as the Normandy rain. But Brenner and his comrades had orders of their own: hold the line at all costs. If Carentan fell, the path to Cherbourg would be open, and the Allies would have their deep-water port. The battle devolved into a deadly rhythm: fire, advance, cover, reload. The hedgerows acted like walls, forcing the paratroopers into narrow lanes where ambushes could be set with brutal efficiency. Winters knew they couldn't afford to get bogged down. Every minute lost here was a minute the Germans used to strengthen their defenses in the town. Flank left, Winters barked, and the men moved, slipping through a gap in the hedgerow. They emerged into an open field and immediately paid the price. Mortar rounds fell like thunder, throwing fountains of mud and shrapnel into the air. One landed so close that the concussion rattled the teeth in Winters's head. Screams cut through the chaos. Medics rushed forward, dragging the wounded to cover as the rest of the unit pressed on. Farther ahead, the 502nd PIR was locked in their own deadly dance with the enemy. Their advance was slowed by sniper fire from a church steeple. Each shot a sharp crack that sent men diving for cover. Sergeant Wild Bill Garnera spotted the glint of a scope and didn't hesitate. One shot from his M1 Garand, and the sniper toppled from the steeple like a ragdoll, his body hitting the roof with a sickening thud before disappearing from sight. By midday, the paratroopers were within striking distance of the crossroads. But the Germans weren't retreating, they were digging in. Machine gun nests covered every approach, and barbed wire choked the lanes. Winters knew they needed something big to break the stalemate. He called for support from the 327th Glider Infantry, who were fighting their way through a parallel route. If they could hit the Germans from the side, the crossroads might fall. Meanwhile, in the German command post, Hauptmann Friedrich Koch studied a map covered in grease pencil lines. Reports were coming in fast, too fast for comfort. His units were holding for now, but the pressure was mounting. The Americans had numbers, momentum, and, most dangerously, a refusal to break. Koch ordered his reserves forward, knowing it was a gamble. If they failed to hold the crossroads, Carentan would be lost by nightfall. The first gliders came in under sporadic enemy fire, bouncing hard on the uneven ground. Men spilled out, their faces pale but determined. Linking up with the 506th, they prepared for a coordinated push. Winters gathered his squad leaders in the shadow of a ruined farmhouse. "We hit them hard and fast," he said, his voice low but firm. "We don't stop until we own that road." The assault began with a deafening artillery barrage. Shells screamed overhead, smashing into the German positions and tearing gaps in the barbed wire. Under the cover of the blasts, the paratroopers surged forward, firing as they ran. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of cordite. Somewhere ahead, the crossroads came into view, a battered intersection of dirt roads, littered with debris and craters. The Germans fought like cornered wolves. An MG-42 opened up from a farmhouse window, cutting down 2 men before a grenade silenced it. Rifle fire rattled from behind a stone wall until Winters himself vaulted over and took the shooter down with a quick double tap. Lipton and his squad cleared a trench, their bayonets glinting in the dim light. By late afternoon, the Americans had taken the crossroads, but at a terrible cost. Bodies lay where they had fallen, their faces slack and eyes staring at nothing. The wounded groaned softly, their cries carried away by the wind. Winters stood in the middle of the intersection, chest heaving, and let the reality sink in. They had won this ground, but the battle for Carentan was far from over. Even as they secured the crossroads, scouts reported fresh German forces moving in from the south. Koch had thrown everything he had into this final counterattack. Tanks rumbled in the distance, their engines growling like predators. The paratroopers scrambled to set up defenses, dragging sandbags into position and sighting their rifles down the roads. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red, as the first shots of the counterattack rang out. Mortars whistled overhead, smashing into the crossroads and sending men diving for cover. Winters yelled for the bazooka team to get into position. A panzer came into view, its turret swinging toward the intersection. The bazooka fired, a flash of light, a trail of smoke, and the shell struck home. The tank erupted in flames, the crew bailing out only to be cut down by rifle fire. But for every tank destroyed, more enemy infantry poured in. The crossroads became a killing ground, every inch fought over with savage determination. Winters moved from position to position, encouraging his men, steadying their fire. The night crept in, and with it, the uncertainty of whether they could hold until dawn. Somewhere in the chaos, Lipton found himself hunkered down beside Garnera, the two men exchanging grim nods between bursts of gunfire. Neither spoke the words that were on both their minds. This could be the night they didn't walk away, but as long as one man was still standing, the crossroads would not fall. By midnight, the counterattack faltered. The Germans, bled white and unable to break through, began to pull back. The crossroads belonged to the Americans, and with it, the road to Carentan lay open. The men didn't cheer, they were too exhausted, too aware of the price paid. They simply held their positions, watching the darkness for the next threat, knowing it would come soon enough. Winters looked out over the field, the silhouettes of his men crouched behind their weapons. In the distance, the faint glow of Carentan shimmered on the horizon. The battle for the town would come next, and it would be worse, much worse. But tonight they had survived. Tonight they had taken one more step toward victory. The sun barely pierced the low-hanging clouds over Carentan as the 101st Airborne prepared for the decisive assault. The streets were a twisted maze of rubble and smoke, the remnants of artillery bombardments from the past days. Every building was a potential death trap, every alley a hidden snare. For the men of Easy Company, the calm before the storm was deafening. Captain Winters moved among his men, checking positions, tightening grips on rifles, whispering words of encouragement. His eyes scanned the horizon, wary of movement, expecting a sniper's rifle or a machine gun to tear through the ranks at any second. He could see the shadows of German paratroopers lurking, their presence almost spectral in the hazy light. Each house was a fortress, every doorway a potential ambush. The town had become a labyrinth of death. The order came down, advance. Slowly, carefully, the paratroopers moved forward, hugging the walls of shattered buildings. Each footstep was measured, each breath controlled. But the moment they turned the first corner, the hell of Carentan revealed itself. A German MG-42 burst from a second-story window, its bullets ripping into the rubble and ricocheting off brick, splintering wood and metal. Corporal Lipton dove behind a broken wall, dragging a wounded comrade with him. "We can't stay here," he shouted, firing his rifle blindly into the shadowed doorway. The enemy fired back in controlled bursts, their training showing in every precise shot. The paratroopers could feel the cold, mechanical efficiency of the Fallschirmjäger. They were facing men who were not just soldiers, they were predators. Winters signaled a maneuver. He and a small squad would flank the building from the side while others provided covering fire. They crawled through shattered hedges, slipping across the mud-slicked streets, their faces streaked with sweat, blood, and grime. A sniper's bullet tore through the wall near Winters, sending shards of brick into his shoulder. He gritted his teeth and pressed on, knowing that hesitation would cost lives. Inside the German positions, Hauptmann Friedrich Koch barked orders. "Hold! Do not let them take the streets. Every man fights." The paratroopers were determined, but so were the Americans. The firefight became a deadly dance of move, shoot, dive, reload, repeat. Smoke and dust clouded the streets, making every shadow potentially lethal. As Winters' flanking squad reached the rear of the building, they lobbed grenades through shattered windows. Explosions shook the foundations, and for a moment, silence fell, only to be replaced by German screams and gunfire from another nearby building. The Americans moved in quickly, clearing rooms with bayonets and rifle butts. Each door opened to new danger, each corridor a gauntlet. The house became a microcosm of the chaos enveloping Carentan. Across the town, Lieutenant Dyke and the 502nd Parachute Infantry were engaged in a parallel nightmare. German snipers in the steeple of the local church picked off men with deadly precision. Dyke moved cautiously, signaling to sharpshooters to neutralize the elevated threats. Mortars fell in bursts around them, splintering walls and sending bricks raining down on the advancing Americans. One shell hit a corner building, collapsing the roof and forcing men to leap through smoke-filled doorways to escape. The fight for Carentan was not only a test of courage but also of improvisation. The paratroopers used every piece of debris, every wall, and every cellar as cover. They moved like shadows, striking hard, then disappearing behind the ruins, leaving confusion in their wake. German counterattacks came in waves, but the Americans had gained momentum, and with every street cleared, the town seemed to inch closer to liberation. Amid the chaos, personal acts of heroism stood out. Private Malarkey dragged a severely wounded comrade through rubble-strewn streets, his body shielded from incoming fire by sheer will and determination. Garner crawled across an open courtyard under machine gun fire to toss grenades into a fortified building, eliminating enemy positions that had stalled their advance. Each act, though small, contributed to the broader objective, taking the town. By mid-afternoon, the Americans had reached the central square of Carentan. The crossroads, the lifeline connecting Utah and Omaha, was finally within reach. But the Germans had prepared their last stand. Tank traps, mines, and machine gun nests had been reinforced along every approach. Any misstep could be fatal. Captain Winters coordinated with other unit leaders, directing artillery and calling for supporting fire from distant positions. Shells screamed overhead, landing with devastating impact. The ground trembled, sending debris flying and obscuring vision with smoke and dust. It was like moving through a storm of iron and fire. Inside one building near the square, Sergeant Lipton's squad faced a relentless assault. German soldiers poured in from adjoining streets, forcing close-quarters combat. Gunfire rang out in bursts, bayonets clashed, and men shouted over the din. Every inch of ground was contested fiercely. The Americans pressed forward, room by room, clearing houses and driving the enemy back. Meanwhile, Winters led a detachment toward the main road, where a German tank had been blocking the path. With a combination of grenades, bazooka fire, and rifle shots, the tank was disabled, its crew taken out. The street opened up for the Americans, but victory came with an almost unbearable cost. Bodies littered the cobblestones, the wounded cried out in pain, and the smell of blood mixed with smoke and wet earth. As night approached, the remaining German forces made one final, desperate attempt to retake the square. They charged in small groups, exploiting gaps in the American lines. Mortars and rifle fire met them instantly, cutting down attackers in brutal precision. The Americans, bloodied and exhausted, held their positions with stubborn resolve. Each man knew the stakes. Carentan had to be taken, no matter the personal cost. By late evening, the streets were eerily quiet. The Germans had either been killed, captured, or retreated into the surrounding countryside. The paratroopers, battered and weary, secured the town. Fires burned in ruined houses, casting flickering shadows over the devastated streets. The crossroads was finally in American hands. Captain Winters walked slowly through the streets, surveying the aftermath. The toll of the battle was written on every face and every corner. Destroyed homes, fallen comrades, and the echoes of screams that would haunt them forever. Yet, amidst the horror, there was relief. The 101st Airborne had held Carentan, linking Utah and Omaha beaches and ensuring that the Allies could continue their push into occupied France. The night brought no celebration, only a somber reflection. Medics worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded under the dim light of lanterns. Soldiers huddled in ruined buildings, bandaging injuries, sharing cigarettes, and exchanging quiet words. The weight of what they had endured pressed on everyone. Winters gathered his remaining officers for a final briefing. "We've secured the town," he said quietly, "but the battle for Normandy isn't over. What we've done here is only the beginning. Remember the men who didn't make it, and honor their sacrifice by finishing what we started." The officers nodded, faces set with determination and grief. Outside, the town of Carentan lay in ruin. Smoke drifted into the night sky, mingling with the cold air. The streets, once lively, were now silent except for the distant sounds of artillery and the occasional shout of a sentry. For the men of the 101st, this was a victory, but it came at a price that would linger in their memories forever. As dawn approached, the first light of a new day revealed the full extent of the devastation. Carentan had been fought over inch by inch, street by street, with courage and sacrifice beyond measure. The paratroopers had proven their mettle, facing elite German forces and the unforgiving terrain of the bocage. The battle was won, but the cost was etched in the mud, rubble, and the hearts of those who survived. The first rays of dawn stretched over Carentan, revealing the full scale of the destruction. Streets were unrecognizable, homes reduced to rubble, and bodies of friend and foe alike lay scattered across the town. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Somewhere, a church bell rang weakly, its sound broken but defiant, echoing over the town as if mourning those who had fallen. For the men of the 101st Airborne, there was no time for relief. Exhaustion weighed heavily on their shoulders, every step through the debris a reminder of the sacrifices that had been made. They had held Carentan, linked Utah and Omaha beaches, and ensured that the momentum of the Allied invasion of Normandy would continue. Yet, amid victory, there was a haunting emptiness. Each man counted the faces missing from his squad, the friends who would never laugh again, the comrades who had given their all to make this day possible. Captain Winters walked slowly through the central square, surveying the battlefield. The crossroads they had fought so fiercely to control was now quiet, the enemy vanquished or in retreat. He knelt beside a fallen comrade, a young soldier whose eyes stared unseeing at the morning sky. Winters' hand hovered for a moment over his chest, a silent tribute. These men were the reason Carentan was won, the reason history would remember this small town in Normandy. Elsewhere, the townspeople emerged from their hiding places. A woman stepped carefully over broken bricks, searching for what remained of her home. Children clung to her skirts, eyes wide with fear and confusion. The Americans moved among them cautiously, offering what comfort they could, sharing rations and giving water. Amid the chaos, humanity persisted, a fragile light in the shadows of war. The wounded were tended to with painstaking care. Medics worked tirelessly, their hands slick with blood, faces etched with concentration and fatigue. The cries of the injured mixed with the quiet sobs of the living, a symphony of suffering and survival. Every life saved felt like a small triumph in the aftermath of so much carnage. Captain Cole gathered the surviving men for a moment of reflection. They sat in silence, weapons set aside, the weight of the past days pressing down. "We've done what few could have imagined," he said quietly. "Carentan stands because of your courage, because of every man who faced death and kept moving forward. Remember this moment, but remember also those we've lost. Their sacrifice will never be forgotten." In the distance, a German convoy was spotted retreating through the bocage. The sound of engines and the rattle of vehicles reminded the paratroopers that the war was far from over. Carentan had been a hard-fought victory, but it was only one step in the larger struggle of Normandy. The Allies would continue to push forward, each town, each crossroads, another chapter in a brutal campaign. The men began clearing the streets, tending to the wounded, and reorganizing their units. Supplies were low, ammunition dwindling, but morale was steadied by the knowledge that they had achieved something extraordinary. Carentan had been transformed from a quiet French town into a battlefield of epic scale, and the courage displayed here would echo throughout the rest of the war. Captain Winters took a moment to write in his journal, the pen scratching over paper that would one day tell the story of Carentan. He described the chaos, the fear, the heroism, and the human cost. But he also wrote of hope. Hope that the men who survived would carry forward the memory of those who had fallen, and that Carentan would eventually heal, becoming a symbol not only of destruction but of resilience and courage. As night fell over Carentan for the second time since the battle began, a quiet settled over the town. Fires burned low, casting long shadows across the streets. Soldiers huddled together for warmth, sharing stories and memories of home, trying to remember life beyond the battlefield. Somewhere, the sound of a child's cry reminded them of what they were fighting for: a future free from tyranny, a world where towns like Carentan could live in peace. The paratroopers knew the cost of their victory. Each man had faced fear and death, seen comrades cut down, and endured the unimaginable chaos of street-to-street combat. But they had prevailed. Carentan was secure, a vital link in the chain of Allied operations in Normandy, and a testament to the courage and tenacity of the 101st Airborne Division. In the following days, reinforcements arrived. Engineers repaired bridges, medics evacuated the wounded, and supplies were brought in. Carentan began the slow process of recovery. The Americans remained vigilant, aware that German forces were regrouping elsewhere, preparing for counterattacks. But for the men who had fought and survived, there was a sense of closure, a knowledge that, for this moment, they had triumphed against incredible odds. The story of Carentan would live on in letters, photographs, and memoirs. Veterans recounted the terror of the hedgerows, the deafening roar of artillery, and the harrowing experience of urban combat. Each retelling honored those who had fallen and served as a reminder of the extraordinary bravery required to face such relentless adversity. For the men who survived, Carentan became more than a victory. It became a part of who they were. The streets they had fought through, the houses they had cleared, the comrades they had lost. These memories etched themselves into their identities, shaping the men they would become after the war. They carried the scars of battle, both visible and unseen, as testaments to the ordeal they had endured. As historians would later record, the battle for Carentan was crucial. It allowed the Allies to link the Utah and Omaha beaches, enabling the continuous flow of troops, equipment, and supplies essential for the success of Operation Overlord. It demonstrated the effectiveness and resilience of the 101st Airborne Division, cementing its reputation as one of the most elite fighting units of the Second World War. Yet, the human cost could never be quantified in reports or statistics. Every name on a casualty list represented a story, a life cut short, a family left grieving. Carentan's streets bore silent witness to the horrors endured and the heroism displayed. The echoes of gunfire, the cries of the wounded, and the courage of the soldiers remained embedded in the town itself, a living memorial to the sacrifices made. Captain Winters and his officers took time to honor the fallen. They placed markers where comrades had fallen, held quiet moments of remembrance, and shared stories of individual acts of valor. These gestures, though small, were profoundly meaningful. They affirmed that no sacrifice would be forgotten, that the bravery displayed would live on in memory and history. In reflecting on the battle, the men understood the broader lessons of Carentan. War was brutal, chaotic, and unpredictable, but courage, determination, and solidarity could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The 101st Airborne had faced an elite enemy, navigated treacherous terrain, and endured the full force of combat, yet emerged victorious. The victory was not just strategic, it was a testament to human resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. As the sun set over Carentan, painting the ruins in gold and crimson, the survivors looked toward the horizon. Beyond lay more battles, more challenges, but for this night, they allowed themselves a moment of reflection. They had fought together, suffered together, and triumphed together. Carentan was theirs not only in strategic terms, but in the deeper sense of having faced fear and emerged alive. The men of the 101st Airborne would carry the memory of Carentan with them for the rest of their lives. Each street cleared, each hedge stormed, each comrade lost and honored, formed a chapter in the story of courage, sacrifice, and perseverance. Carentan would forever be remembered not only as a pivotal battle in Normandy, but as a symbol of the extraordinary human spirit that endures even amidst the horrors of war. And as history would show, the victory at Carentan was not merely a tactical success. It was a human triumph. In the end, it was the courage of ordinary soldiers, facing impossible odds, that shaped the outcome of the battle and paved the way for the Allied advance into France. If you've been captivated by the bravery and sacrifice of the 101st Airborne in Carentan, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Join us for more incredible stories of history's most intense battles, where courage, strategy, and humanity collide. Hit that notification bell to never miss a story that reveals the hidden moments and the heroes who shaped the course of history. Because the legacy of Carentan is more than just names and dates. It's a lesson in resilience, in courage, and in what ordinary people can achieve when faced with extraordinary circumstances.